President Trump attacks the mainstream media as allegations of his team's relationship with Russia swirl.
General Flynn is a wonderful man. I think he's been treated very, very unfairly by the media.
Good evening. 26 days in, and there is tonight all the evidence of chaos reigning in the White House in the aftermath of the sacking of the National Security Advisor, General Flynn. Even so, the administration continues to try to reshape America's relationship with the world. Trump seeming to abandon US support for a two-state solution in the Middle East, and his defense secretary giving an ultimatum to NATO: contribute more or we'll contribute less. Tonight, we'll be speaking with a top White House official.
Also on tonight's programme, who is the woman in the Laugh Out Loud T-shirt? CCTV images are released after the mysterious death of the North Korean leader's half-brother. Amid reports he was poisoned, Malaysian police arrest a woman.
By the rivers of Babylon.
The Church of England blesses cats, dogs, pubs and ships, but not gay couples. As the General Synod prepares to vote to preserve its traditional stance on marriage, is the rift irreparable? And so many parents are affected, but so few get the support they need. The women who've had early miscarriages, but say they're left feeling unsupported and alone.
Also tonight, a giant wall to keep the trolls out. No, not Donald Trump, but the work of the British writer Neil Gaiman. We talk to him tonight about how he uses fantasy to explain the all-too-real events in our world. He's blamed intelligence officials for leaking illegal information to the media and blamed the media for treating his sacked National Security Advisor very, very unfairly. President Trump has brushed aside allegations that his advisors were in constant contact with Russian officials during the election campaign in a flurry of tweets claiming that, quote, conspiracy theories and blind hatred were being delivered by what he called the fake news media. Our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris, joins us now. Kylie.
John, this story is moving at breakneck speed. So just to recap some of the detail, as you say, yesterday the president asked his national security advisor, Mike Flynn, to resign when it became public that the White House had known for weeks that he had lied about his contacts with the Russian ambassador. Now today, a kind of a sequel to that, new reports based on fresh leaks that during the presidential campaign, others, aside from Mike Flynn, in Donald Trump's inner circle, had their own repeated contacts with senior Russian intelligence and members of the Russian government. Now, at least one of those people, Paul Manafort, who was a campaign manager at the time, has flatly denied that story. Amidst all of this, Donald Trump is trying to wrest the focus back to business as usual. A very interesting press conference he's just held with Israel's Prime Minister, indicative of that. But over in Congress, there is a sense of almost political whiplash as Democrats and some Republicans campaign to have the many questions about Mike Flynn, about these other Russian contacts, answered. Just 26 days into the Trump presidency, and another test is looming for America's democratic institutions.
That's the purpose of the investigation, is to figure out what happened and what didn't.
In the corridors on Capitol Hill, there's talk of little else. Just as the courts stop Donald Trump's controversial immigration ban, will Congress force a public investigation into his inner circle's reported links to Russia? Democratic Senator Cory Booker thinks it must. He takes a moment by the lifts to explain why.
Yeah, it's disturbing. It's highly disturbing, and it raises more and more questions that Congress has a sworn obligation to get to the bottom of. And so everything right now, to me, just further illustrates the urgency for investigating this thoroughly and exhaustively.
Congress is in a spin over the sacking yesterday of National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and what it's revealed about the White House. Senator John McCain says nothing less is at stake than the nation's security.
Makes it very difficult for us to exercise responsibilities as to defend the nation. There is turmoil as far as national security is concerned within the White House. The first step is to provide and appoint a new national security advisor.
But just appointing a new national security advisor won't satisfy Senator Tim Kaine, who wants the current investigation into Russian meddling in the election to dig deeper.
Now it's the connections between the Russian government and not just the election, but also the administration. And I think that means that the investigation will go forward. And, you know, how long will it take? But we'll get to the bottom of it. We'll answer the questions about the contact between the Russian government and the campaign and the administration.
Donald Trump would say the senator's been watching too much fake media, that the Russian connection is nonsense, fueled by conspiracy theories and blind hatred. In a press conference with Israel's Prime Minister, the president almost seemed to regret asking for Mike Flynn's resignation.
I think it's very, very unfair what's happened to General Flynn, the way he was treated, and the documents and papers that were illegally, I stress that, illegally leaked. Very, very unfair.
And I do find it shocking how much top secret information seems to find its way into our media these days.
Veteran diplomat and intelligence chief John Negroponte warns against any Watergate-type comparisons. He downplays the turmoil and credits the president with getting down to business. After all, the defence secretary is off in Brussels meeting on NATO, and the Secretary of State at the G20 meeting Boris Johnson tomorrow.
So this is positive. The diplomatic train has left the station, but it'd be helpful to have someone in the White House, too, who can help orchestrate these things.
There's a fine line between unpredictability and chaos. Whoever replaces Mike Flynn at the White House, an early bet is Vice Admiral Robert Harwood, will have to negotiate it and help to rebuild trust in a commander-in-chief tainted for some by his and his people's relationships with Russia.
Kylie Morris in Washington. Well, there was plenty more from that Donald Trump press conference, with the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu and the US leader appearing to move away from America's long-standing commitment to a two-state solution to the Middle East conflict.
So I'm looking at two-state and one-state, and I like the one that both parties like. I'm very happy with the one that both parties like. I can live with either one. I thought for a while the two-state looked like it may be the easier of the two. But honestly, if Bibi and if the Palestinians, if Israel and the Palestinians are happy, I'm happy with the one they like the best.
Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is with us. Lindsay, two-state solution dead?
Well, that's what the State Department are trying to find out. Apparently, they've been contacting the White House today to try and find out if there's a change in policy. It's not at all clear if President Trump knows which is which and what it means. But what is clear is that the far right in Israel, the Jewish Home movement led by Naftali Bennett, they know what this means, and they heralded what he said and said, yes, this is the end of a possibility of the Palestinians having their own state. So they see him as very much on their side. Now, he did say to Prime Minister Netanyahu he wanted the Israelis to hold back on settlements. That's a much more classic American policy. But, you know, the way they were together, he called him Bibi, not Prime Minister, and Mr. Netanyahu talked about how close their family links were. It was very clear that the right and far right in Israel have a massive ally in President Donald Trump.
Well, now, there's another area in which he cozied up to Israel, in a sense. Israel always eternally worried about Iran, despite the fact there are Jewish communities that live there. He and the Israelis are now going to think very hard about going against Iran.
Well, I think the other thing which is very interesting is that what Prime Minister Netanyahu said was it wasn't just the US and Israel. He said that other countries in the neighborhood, by which he means Gulf Arab countries, also now understand, as he put it, the magnitude of the Iranian threat. And he said that those countries no longer see Israel as an enemy, but as an ally. Well, that's something of an exaggeration. But there is some truth in this, that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries do see Iran as an immediate threat. And there has been a lot more intelligence sharing and talking to Israel about regional security. So this is really quite a big change in the region. And the thing which I think is so interesting, or in a way so strange, is that in the Arab countries, they really do have a strong feeling for the Palestinian people and a strong anti-Israeli feeling. But when you go to Iran, they don't have that feeling. There isn't such a solidarity with the Palestinian people. So there you have a sense in which the governments are completely detached from the feelings of their people, but geopolitics moves in a different way.
Lindsay Hilsum. Well, joining us now from Washington, Lanny Davis, who was President Bill Clinton's lawyer at the White House, and in New York, Mika Mosbacher, who is a supporter of Donald Trump. Mika Mosbacher, we're wondering why, if General Flynn did nothing wrong, as indeed Mr. Trump says, why did he lie about it?
First of all, he did absolutely nothing wrong. The legal counsel at the White House did investigate this in terms of legalities. But the issue is he did cover up. And he did put President Trump in an untenable situation. He had to choose between General Flynn and supporting his vice president. And yes, it took a few days to sort it out, but once he did, he felt he was accountable to the American people. He promised transparency and to drain the swamp. And so unfortunately, he had to let General Flynn go. It was a trust issue.
Well, I mean, but is a cover-up a lie or terminological inexactitude?
Whether he forgot or did not disclose the full content of the conversation with the Russian ambassador, it was, unfortunately, an inconvenient truth.
Okay.
So therefore, he has been let go. But let me say this, there is a much bigger issue at play here, and that is the leaking of sensitive and highly classified information to the news media that apparently is coming from Clinton operatives who are embedded in some of the agencies.
Ah,
and
so
who were there
you would
during the
be
transition.
absolutely in favor of a major congressional inquiry into this, and a Senate inquiry too. We've got to get to the bottom of it, right?
I would be in favor of revealing and being accountable to the American people.
No, that's not quite what I asked. That's not quite what I asked. I asked, are you in favor, because you're so concerned, you want to get at the truth, would you like to see your Republican-dominated Congress and Senate investigate this matter?
I'm in favor of getting at the truth, and I'd like to point out that the bipartisan watchdog group here in Washington, D.C., Judicial Watch, has been extremely involved over the past several years in investigating Hillary Clinton.
Well, now, let me just go to Lanny Davis, because he's just had a guffaw. Let's check his guffaw. What's the laughter? Lanny Davis.
Well, the first guffaw is to call Judicial Watch bipartisan. Nobody even, that's not even a Saturday Night Live joke. They would not agree that they're bipartisan. They're highly Republican and conservative. But
well, as a lawyer, let me ask you as a lawyer then, do you think there is a need for a legal investigation of this, or should it be left to the Senate and Republican investigative authorities?
Well, it should certainly, to answer the question that was refused to be answered, there certainly should be a congressional investigation to the same extent that Congress wanted to investigate Benghazi and emails and other subjects. So yes, of course there needs to be a congressional investigation. There also needs to be transparency. Your guest refers to favoring transparency. Why is Donald Trump not answering the question, did anyone in your campaign have communications with Russians or Russian government officials regarding the disclosures and the leaks, I would say, the favorite word of your guest, in the middle of the Clinton campaign that the entire intelligence community, including the FBI, said was in order to help Donald Trump and not help Hillary Clinton. That's another place where Donald Trump should follow the advice of your guest, be transparent, and answer all the questions about what knowledge he had about all those alleged conversations between Russian government officials and his own campaign.
Well,
transparency.
Mika Mosbacher, you've been very close to the Donald Trump campaign and the rest of it. How bad is the relationship between the White House and the press? I mean, is it right for the President of the United States, whose Constitution guarantees free speech, to call CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, fake news?
Yes, absolutely, especially when they come out with stories that are unsubstantiated. I think American people are thrilled that finally
I thought
he's
you just
taking
told
on
me
an
that the
institution.
intelligence community had been leaking. So that's that they haven't. It's just unsubstantiated nonsense, is it?
It is not unsubstantiated nonsense. And I want to go back to Judicial Watch, with all due respect to Lanny. That argument is all hat, no cattle, as we say in Texas. Judicial Watch filed all the way back Freedom of Information Acts with federal courts And they ruled last week in federal court that they would not release for 17 months through the FBI email stating to Clinton.
Okay,
so
well,
I asked, first of all, why wasn't that administration, the Obama administration was not
I'm very sorry.
transparent.
Mika Mospacho, thank you very much. Lanny Davis.
Notice how Mika didn't describe them as bipartisan, which is a Saturday Night Live laughable line, Mika. Do your homework. They called themselves Republican and conservative, not bipartisan. You should be embarrassed that you didn't know.
Do your homework,
we have to leave
Lanny.
it. No, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed both for joining us.
Thank you.
And later, we will be speaking to one of President Trump's top White House officials, Sebastian Gorka. Kathy.
Thanks, John. Now, it reads like the plot of a cloak and dagger murder mystery. The half-brother of North Korea's dictator collapsing in the departure hall of Kuala Lumpur Airport after apparently being sprayed with poison. One female suspect is now under arrest. A grainy photograph of a young woman wearing a T-shirt emblazoned LOL, laugh out loud, going viral around the world. Latest reports claim North Korean diplomats are frantically trying to prevent an autopsy being carried out on Kim Jong-nam. Spending so long at the Malaysian morgue, they sent out for a Kentucky Fried Chicken takeaway. Kieran Jenkins has this.
Your latest dose of news more fanciful than fiction begins with this ambulance, inside which is the body of Kim Jong-nam, heading for tests to determine if he was poisoned by hit women working for his younger brother. Kim Jong-nam had a home in Macau with his second wife and children. The first wife and son are in Beijing. All are now under Chinese protection. It was to Macau he was heading on Monday, when, according to one report, he was attacked with a poison pen at Kuala Lumpur Airport.
CCTV 화면도 공개됐습니다. 화면 보시죠.
Fuzzy photos on South Korean TV claim to show the alleged assassin. A woman in a jumper reading LOL, laugh out loud. Which begs the question, WTF, who is this female? Malaysian authorities say they've arrested a 29-year-old travelling on a Vietnamese passport. Had things been different, Kim Jong-nam could have been stood here as divine leader. North Korea held a 75th birthday party for his dead father today. Instead, younger son Kim Jong-un is master of ceremonies and almost literally calling the shots. 3 years ago, he had a firing squad execute his powerful uncle, one of at least 300 perceived opponents he's had killed, according to unverified reports. In public, Kim Jong-nam showed more interest in gambling and international travel than in toppling the regime's leadership. South Korean intelligence said today he'd written to his brother in 2012, pleading for his life. That same year, Kim Jong-un issued a warrant for his death.
Pyongyang has been constantly preparing for the assassination, and the murder was committed as a result of a long-time effort. We consider this incident a reflection of Kim Jong-un's paranoid character.
It is also, like this week's weapons test, a projection of power. As well as missiles, he can launch special operations on foreign soil.
I think what we're seeing now may be the beginning of a gradual escalation in terms of bigger and better missile tests and maybe even nuclear tests.
But while America and China ponder their response, North Koreans today laid flowers in memory of Kim Jong-il, not yet aware that one son has seemingly poisoned the other.
Well, now, earlier I spoke to Chanso Lee, a North Korean defector and author of The Girl with Seven Names. I began by asking her reaction to the death of Kim Jong-nam.
I whole day I had some gloomy feeling because I'm also doing some kind of dangerous work. I know I was already targeted by the regime, but this means like cautious to me that I have to be careful.
Can you tell us what you think has happened
I think North Korean regime, Kim Jong-un did that, current dictator. Last year, there's a high-ranking defectors, including the elite family from North Korea. They were trying to make a refugee government in exile.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very serious. And they're putting the leader as Kim Han-sol, which was Kim Jong-nam's son. So I think this is the sign to stop this refugee government. Right now, what's my concern is that there's another his brother still alive, whose name is Kim Pyong-il. He is an ambassador in Poland right now. He's the only one right now left who can be threatened to our current dictator in North Korea.
What happened in Kuala Lumpur airport seems very open and a very strange event. I mean, is the woman obviously Korean? It would be hard for us to know.
Oh yeah, absolutely, she's Korean, and then even she's beautiful. So she's on the picture. It looks she's not Malaysian, because it looks exactly same like us.
Not Malaysian, definitely North Korean.
To have a Malaysian passport is very easy these days.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and yeah, they are using always beautiful ladies. It's the biggest weapon.
You mean a beautiful woman is less suspicious?
Or can be perfect to use propaganda tool. For example, if there's Olympics or World Cup game, they always send the beautiful girls. So many people around the world, they thought all North Korean women are so beautiful because they only saw the women sent by the regime. It's just a propaganda tool. So even the spies.
What about how the government is feeling at the moment? Is a missile test, a murder, do they add up to some degree of new paranoia? What's going on, do you think?
I think, the missile test is they already prepared the missile test. Tomorrow is all in North Korea the biggest holiday about all the past dear leaders. His birthday, so to celebrate his birthday, he runs to the missile, but the main reason is to try to test the new government in America, Trump government. They wanted to see how Trump government react about their missile test, unlike the previous government, Obama's government. That's kind of their testing about the reactions. That's why they did that.
Very interesting, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed for talking with us.
Thank you.
Now here, workers at Tata Steel have agreed a deal which means their pensions benefits will be slashed in order to save thousands of jobs. Members of 3 unions voted overwhelmingly to back the plan after Tata bosses promised to invest £1 billion over the next 10 years into modernising its UK operations. But it's come at a cost, as our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis now reports.
Thousands of workers had been balloted, the stakes incredibly high. Would they stomach a hit on their pensions to help save jobs from Port Talbot to Shotton, Corby and beyond? More than 70% said yes.
A big moment, do you think?
A big moment with significant sacrifices, I must say. I do stand here with a heavy heart in the respect of it's a little bit of closure going forward, but what our people have sacrificed for this, and whatever way they had to vote, people need to understand how difficult it was for them to vote this, because it is a heavy price to pay.
The price? Agreeing to surrender their long-standing final salary pension scheme for a much less generous defined contribution scheme. This is what in December Tata's Indian owners said must happen in order for them to seek to avoid compulsory redundancies for 5 years, keep the 2 blast furnaces at Port Talbot going for at least 5 years, and invest £1 billion across Tata's UK steel operations over 10 years.
Do you think this moment means a guaranteed 5 years of blast furnace steel making here in Port Talbot?
That's what we're being assured by the company. I hope they stick to the assurances and do not let us down.
But exactly what must happen next seems a little unclear. Tata's Christmas offer came wrapped in big caveats. Today's concession by the workers, just one of them. Still in Port Talbot this afternoon, there was acknowledgement of perhaps a big corner being turned.
It's a shame that they've had to take a hit on the pension, but you know, when you weigh it up, it means so much for the coming future.
My parents both worked in the steelworks. I know a lot of people who work in the steelworks, and obviously this town would be nothing without it. So I think that we just got to accept it. We didn't have any other choice.
There's a lot of, I'd say, better feeling in Port Talbot. The way things have gone compared to where we were last year, it's a much better situation. There's a much better feeling in the town, definitely, yeah.
This vote has been fated by politicians who highlight the profits now being made here. The message coming out of Port Talbot today: the workers have done what they can. It's now up to Tata and governments to deliver. Now, it's fair to say today marks yet another very significant step forward in the campaign to save these totemic steelworks behind me and other UK operations. But dare I say it, and this will come as little surprise, it's far from over. This remains a deeply, desperately slow and complex process, because Tata Steel didn't just want their workers to say they'll accept a new pension scheme. They actually want to hive off completely the whole massive British Steel pension scheme from the business, for it to operate as a separate entity. And how exactly that's going to happen, well, we don't yet know. They also want certain profit targets met every year, otherwise that £1 billion investment could be at risk. So in summary, it's looking a whole load better here in Port Talbot than it was a year ago. There's no question about that. But I don't think you're going to be seeing people celebrating just yet.
Andy in Newport, thanks very much. Well, if some workers are having to dig deep to save their jobs, Britain's labour market does appear to be booming, with more people in work than ever before and unemployment at its lowest level in over a decade. But there was an unexpected slowdown in wage increases and a slight drop in the number of people from the rest of the European Union coming to work here. Our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is here. Helia, tell us what's important about this slowdown in pay?
Well, if I show you what weekly wages have looked like since 2001, you can see that they started quite modestly, but they begin to soar, and they reach the lofty heights of an average of £500 a week by 2007. Of course, after that, you have the global financial crisis and pay plummets. That's basically been the direction of travel till about 2 years ago, which is why households have felt the pinch despite cheap borrowing. Well, over the last 2 years, we have had wage inflation. But the problem today comes not from the fact that wage growth hasn't met economists' expectations, but that if you look at the whole time graph, you can see we have never actually caught up to where we were in 2007, creating this £21 a week pay gap in earnings. And that's important because we're going into a more difficult economic period with potentially inflation and interest rate rises.
So how much should we read into this drop in the number of EU workers?
Well, the official figures actually point to a more interesting theme rumbling under the surface of the economy. And this is all about the equilibrium we have to have in every society between the workforce, who pay tax on the one hand, and the people who are retired, where a lot of that tax spend goes on the other. Now, as the demographic shifts in our society, there are more and more people living past retirement age, which is putting the cost of supporting them on a smaller workforce, creating this seesaw imbalance in the economy. Well, labour market consultants Mercer have said that by 2030 in the UK, 300,000 less people are set to be born into the workforce, while the number of pensioners is set to grow by 3.4 million, making that imbalance much more unsustainable. And the kicker from Mercer, well, is if we tighten down on immigration, that problem will become much worse. And for the government, what's difficult is to reconcile this with their pledge to curb immigration.
Helia, thank you very much. Now, 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in miscarriage, 85% of those in the first 12 weeks. A leading obstetrician has told this programme it's time society took early miscarriage more seriously and has called on GPs to change their attitudes. Fatima Manji has spoken to women who've experienced an early miscarriage and who say the experience left them feeling unsupported and alone. And just to warn you, her report does contain distressing themes.
We started trying in January and then we found out we were pregnant in April, so it was really quite quick. So we were just overly excited. Couldn't believe it when we found out it was positive.
We had lots of plans, names, wanting to find out whether it was a boy or a girl. Not that it mattered, but just so that we could buy the clothes, make all the arrangements and just do things like that, really.
For both women, these feelings were soon shattered. Their excitement turned to shock, and then a struggle to cope with a loss that they felt society didn't even acknowledge. At her 12-week scan, Claire Kenny found out something had gone wrong.
She said there's no heartbeat, and that it looked like there hadn't been a heartbeat from about 9 weeks. I thought a miscarriage was that you would have been bleeding, and I'd had nothing like that at all. So initially, yeah, I thought she was wrong, and then realised that she wasn't. And I had to come out of that room then, walk past a room of pregnant women. I was upset. I remember thinking I didn't want to upset them.
Claire had to have surgery because she hadn't miscarried naturally.
And I remember the paperwork said termination on it, and I didn't want to sign it. To me, it wasn't a termination. I don't feel that the doctor perhaps explained it very sympathetically. I felt it was just a case of it happens quite a lot, it's happened to you.
She went on to become pregnant again and now has a daughter. But 6 years on, Claire still feels the raw emotion from her miscarriage experience. And that's only changed recently through counselling.
I did feel guilty because nobody could explain why it had happened. I kept going back over things that I'd done that perhaps had caused it to happen. Initially, yeah, everybody was very sympathetic. I think then as time goes on, it's sort of a case of, well, that happened. It was a while ago it happened. Haven't you got over it yet? Why are you still upset?
People might say the NHS is stretched. Do you think it's reasonable to expect more to be done?
Some of the things I expect to be done don't actually cost any money whatsoever. I appreciate that doctors deal with matters like this all the time, and they may become a bit used to it, a bit hardened to it, but a little bit of sympathy, a little bit of understanding and appreciation, that costs nothing whatsoever.
With 1 in 4 pregnancies ending in miscarriage, providing support for every woman can be difficult. At the National Centre for Miscarriage Research in Coventry, the focus is on discovering why miscarriages happen. But Professor Siobhan Quinby also wants to change how women are treated when they do.
There's some sort of cultural thing that the miscarriage happened early, so it doesn't matter. But in fact, the amount of grief is not proportionate to how long you were pregnant or how big the baby was or how old the baby was. The amount of grief is to loss of dreams, loss of hope and loss of a future.
She particularly wants to urge GPs not to prescribe antidepressants too quickly in these cases and instead offer appropriate support.
A lot of people end up taking antidepressants and being diagnosed with depression and anxiety when actually they're having a normal grief reaction.
Cheryl Barker is still working through her grief. She had a miscarriage last year. 6 weeks pregnant, she received a phone call with results of her blood test.
It was just a case of, you will miscarry, expect some pain, expect some bleeding, and then just call us once you've started bleeding. And literally that was the phone call. She was on the phone to me less than 5 minutes.
Initially in shock, Cheryl then found nothing happened for 2 days. She and her husband convinced themselves there must have been a mix-up, and Cheryl went into work.
I'd got to work and the pain just hit me, and I just started bleeding like I've never bled before. And no one at work knew I was pregnant at the time. So I actually went to my boss and I said, I think I'm having a miscarriage, I need to go.
She took herself to hospital in pain and heavily bleeding. But Cheryl feels the way she was treated once there made things worse.
They took me into a little bay and it was just so undignified, you know. I'm bleeding and they're there and they're prodding about and they're going, oh, you've passed all the materials. And I'm sitting there thinking, that's not materials, that's my baby. Whether it's 6 weeks or 6 months, I still had that image in my head of my child and when I was going to give birth and everything else. And it was just awful.
Cheryl really wants to have a child. And even though she worries about the future, she's speaking out now so that other women don't feel isolated like she did.
We are trying again, but I'm petrified. And it does scare me that if I do fall pregnant again, that this is going to happen again. so many people around me are now pregnant, and of course I'm really happy for them, but at the same time it's heartbreaking for me because I should have had my baby by now.
You just feel like you're the only person it's happened to, and then you find out that you're not at all.
Well, if you have been affected by a miscarriage and need advice, you can visit our website, which is channel4.com/support.
Well, back to tonight's main news. And Donald Trump has been hitting back against reports that members of his team had constant contacts, quote, with Russian officials during the election campaign, accusing US intelligence agents of leaking information to what he called the fake news media. Joining us now from Washington is one of Mr. Trump's top White House officials, Sebastian Gorka. Good evening, Mr. Gorka. Thank you very much for joining us. The big question is, if General Flynn did nothing wrong, according to the president, why did he lie about it?
Oh, that's very easy to answer. So the National Security Advisor deals with the most sensitive matters and is the closest counsel on national security issues to the most powerful politician or executive office holder in the world. So that relationship must be built 100% on implicit trust. And as the president has already stated, that trust was not 100% with General Flynn, especially with regards to his comments to the vice president before he went on some television shows here. And when that trust failed, then the resignation was accepted from General Flynn.
So there then follows, I guess, your desire to get all this thing cleared up. I mean, there are enormous quantities of allegations about constant contacts with the Russians during the campaign and questionable arrangements or deals or whatever. Would you be pleased to see a congressional inquiry to get to the bottom of this?
Well, look, I read these reports every day, and I have to say I'm very amused by 80–90% of what I read, because I'm reading stories sourced to anonymous sources that we have, in most cases, no resemblance to reality, recording the events I was involved in the day before. So it's easy to write an article with unnamed sources. So let's stick to the facts. The facts of the matter are, he was the National Security Advisor designate. In our system, after an election, you have several months when you are in that position. It's very unlike the British system, where you win an election and a week later you're in 10 Downing Street. And it was his job to reach out to his counterparts around the world, and that's what he did. And he's the only position, the National Security Advisor is the only position that is not confirmed by Congress. And as such, the transition team moved out day one. So he had these meetings, he made telephone conversations, as he has had a mandate to do. The issue was how he represented them to his superiors, the Vice President and the President here in the White House.
But, I mean, we do have the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, no end of respectable organizations who have published and named some of the people and some of the sources, and the president calls them fake news. You presumably support his view that those respected organs are fake news.
I would say there is a significant issue with much of the reporting, and there seems to be a lot of bias and agenda-driven media. If anybody's surprised at that, then they've probably been living in a cave for the last 4 weeks. It isn't just about unbiased reporting, unfortunately, even from organs that have in the past a great reputation. As a person who's inside the administration, who is also being triangulated, I can tell you it's not all about unbiased reporting.
Okay, well,
in many cases, quite the opposite.
Let me take you on to another subject, which is something which has happened today, and that is the meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Would it be right to say that the two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine issue is dead?
I'm not going to comment on the substantive issues that were discussed, because here it's still not even 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So we'll wait until the official statements come out from after the meeting. But it is absolutely on the record that our relationship with Israel is unbreakable.
Yes.
Nevertheless, when it comes to peace in the Middle East, we have to see both sides come to the table to negotiate. It's not our job to solve it for them. It is for the negotiating parties to do that, and we will stand behind the peace process.
So we don't know at this phase, at this moment?
Too early by US time here to make any substantive comment on the talks.
Sebastian Gorka, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Some breaking news now, and Church of England leaders have just voted to throw out a controversial report on same-sex marriage and homosexuality. In the last few minutes, the General Synod voted against the House of Bishops report, which, although it called for a culture of welcome and support, remained opposed to gay marriage. Well, that result has only just come through. Earlier, Paul McNamara was at the Synod meeting to hear the debate, and a warning: his report does contain flash photography right from the start.
I am now very happy to announce that you are now legally...
The stroke of midnight, 29th of March 2014.
You are now wife and wife.
Some couples didn't want to wait a second longer than need be on the day same-sex marriage was legalised. But where the law led, the Church of England did not follow. Nearly 3 years later, and the issue is still in debate. Today, the Church's governing body, the General Synod, is voting whether to take note of a report by the House of Bishops. The report being discussed, dissected and voted on behind me took 3.5 years of so-called shared conversations. And after all that, what change did it finally recommend? Well, very little. The ban on same-sex marriage still remains. Clergy can't even bless a same-sex marriage. What is on the table? A change in tone. For many, this is too vague, let alone nowhere near progressive enough.
We don't want equal marriage overnight. We know that's not going to happen. But right now, what we do need to see is the Church moving towards some kind of acknowledgement and acceptance of the fact that our relationships are just as valid as the next person. This is just about love. What's so terrifyingly scary about that?
Christians from the LGBT community say many of their fellow parishioners have fully accepted them, but their church has not.
I love my church and I love my God, and I think it's important that the church include everyone who wants to be part of it, and I hate the fact that I'm not included as much as I should be.
I'm really shocked that in an age where we can have a priest blessing a nuclear submarine or a tank or an icon or a pet even, that great gay, lesbian people who are faithful to the church and serving the church can't have their relationships blessed in a church by a priest.
And what's decided here today will echo around the world for members of the Anglican Church. Canon Jeremy Pemberton was the first member of the clergy to marry a member of the same sex. He's all too aware of the arguments against change.
I think Conservatives would say that there was a motion passed in 1987 which said that the only sex that people should have was between a man and a woman who are married to each other for life. So anything apart from that is very wrong.
Campaigners say one of the problems is exemptions from equality law for religious groups.
It says that if a person applying to be a priest is married to a same-sex partner, they'll be refused, and if they're already ordained, they'll be denied promotion. This is absolutely outrageous discrimination, which would never be tolerated by any other institution in our society.
This evening, senior clergy will decide whether or not to take note of minor concessions to the LGBT community. Neither outcome will see an end to inequality.
Well, for some insights on what tonight's Synod vote might mean, I'm joined now by Tracy Byrne, Chief Executive of the Lesbian and Gay Christian Movement, who you've just seen in Paul's report there, and in Westminster is the Bishop of Liverpool, Paul Bayes. Bishop, starting with you, this is a historic defeat for the bishops, isn't it?
I don't think it's a defeat. I think the issue is that we, the bishops, are having to take note of what the Synod said. We produced a report for them. The whole point of the report was so that the rest of the church could have a good look at it. They have had a good look at it by a narrow majority in the House of Clergy. They've decided not to take note of it.
Right, so now that you have lost, when will you start treating gay couples as equals in the church?
I think the issue is for us, how are we going to be faithful? How are we going to be faithful to LGBTI people? How are we going to turn our backs on homophobia, on historic homophobia? And how are we going to be faithful as Christians to our tradition? And that takes a long time for us to keep talking. It's very good that we've managed to talk about it openly today. And I think that certainly when I go back to Liverpool, where I'm the bishop, I will be working for the maximum freedom for churches to provide the welcome that we can within our laws. But the only way we're going to change is if we do it together, and I'm afraid that takes time.
Tracy Byrne, have you got more time? Can you wait more on this?
I think I'm concerned that the Church of England can't afford to wait too much longer. I think people are looking at us from the outside and thinking, we're watching children washed up on beaches in refugee situations, and here we are arguing about what people get up to in bed. I think it makes the church look increasingly irrelevant, obsessed with things that most people are actually embracing now and seeing as a sign of blessing and love and compassion and all the things that we talk about in the gospel. I think people on the outside of the church are looking in and saying, what on earth are they playing at? So I'm concerned we don't have that much more time.
Paul Bayes, that's the point, isn't it? I mean, the church blesses cats, dogs, pubs and ships. Why not gay couples?
Indeed. Well, the issue for us is always, how are we going to be faithful? How are we going to be faithful to the people who come to us? And I do agree with you. I've got members of my own family who are in same-sex marriages or in civil partnerships. In my own diocese, we've got a congregation which has been set up to provide a welcome for LGBTI people. We want to do that. We want to be as free as we can within the laws that we have. And when the church is ready to move, we will move. Today was a step, and the bishops were given notice that we need to think harder, and we'll do that.
But you've had 3 years of conversations and thinking.
Yes,
now the time
and those
for
3
action?
years. Those 3 years of conversations are hugely important, and they have transformed the situation so that the Synod today, as a result of those 3 years, can say what it said to us. We have been listening, and we need to continue to listen. The bishops will be taking note of what has been said today. And in my own belief, it will be great that we can move forward together, but we can only do it when we're ready.
Tracy Byrne, the bishops aren't ready, clearly.
I think the bishops really do have to take note, and I hope they are taking note and realising that actually these words are fine. Words like welcome are fine, but that's still about you asking us to come to your table. And what we're saying is we're here already, we're not going anywhere. It's our church too. And I think we need to begin to really have faith in there being some practical steps that are going to change this situation. And the first one of those is actually that we deeply disagree on this topic. We are not ever going to agree, and we cannot wait for agreement in order to begin to move forward. We've got to recognise that people can be in different places theologically on this, but still learn to live with one another. And we need some practical steps to make that begin to happen.
Well, but it sounds like the rift is irreparable from what you're saying and from what the bishop's saying.
No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. I think that I'm disappointed that this report was not taken note of, because one of the things it said was that in the dioceses and the parishes we can work for maximum freedom under the current law. Change in the law takes a long time, but maximum freedom is something we can reach out for now. I don't want to be in a homophobic church. I don't want to be in a church that closes the door on love.
But it is a homophobic church at the moment, isn't it, Bishop?
Not as far as I would want it to be. I am working my socks off in Liverpool to extend the love that we can extend as a church to LGBTI people.
Tracy Byrne, is this a homophobic church? It absolutely is a homophobic church. If you listen to what LGBT people are saying, they're saying they don't feel safe. We had a situation yesterday where the openly gay people in the General Synod there was a photograph of them. You could have fitted it on something this big. There are a dozen of them. People genuinely do not feel safe disclosing their sexuality, talking about their relationships, talking about their love for one another, because they are afraid of what the church will do as a result of that. They're afraid that they will lose their jobs, their homes, the respect of people around them. We're in a homophobic institution. Even if that is not what the bishops intend it to be, that is how we are feeling and experiencing the church right now.
Tracy Byrne, I'm sorry, on that note of rancour, we have to end it there. Bishop Paul Bayes, too, thank you very much for joining us. John.
After the break, we talk to the prolific fantasy author Neil Gaiman. His latest work reimagines the Norse myths, which, it turns out, have a lot to tell us about the world today.
Welcome back. Well, from the epic trials of Thor to the halls of Valhalla, it seems Norse mythology has more than a few parallels with the uncertainty of today's hyper-anxious world. A fact that hasn't escaped the author Neil Gaiman, as I found out when I went to talk to him earlier today.
I could use a fellow like you.
In American Gods, his latest TV adaptation, Neil Gaiman again transports us to a fantasy world of myths and magic. Gaiman's huge range of work takes in Time Lords like Doctor Who.
I think you should be very, very careful.
And magical creatures, such as you see in his best-selling Sandman series. And now his fascination with storytelling has led him to retell ancient Norse myths. timeless tales of Scandinavian gods, demons and dwarves. Fantastical they may be, but Gaiman sees a parallel with today's troubled times. Why Norse mythology? What made you do it?
I've been in love with Norse mythology since I was a kid. I was probably 6 years old when I discovered the Marvel Comics Thor. I loved how strange, funny sometimes, and also dark they were. These wonderful tales of trickster Loki, of wise but untrustworthy Odin, of huge, powerful, mighty, but not necessarily the brightest hammer in the bag Thor, and the way that they were all heading towards Ragnarok, the end of everything, the battle that's going to finish the world. It was just my favourite myth cycle.
In the story, The Master Builder, Odin, the most powerful Norse god, proposes a wall to keep out the giants and the trolls. I suppose it made me laugh with the sort of contemporary political reference. How do you think history and mythology helps us make sense of the great ructions going on in Western politics at the moment?
I think we can learn a lot. The place where I keep going and where my head keeps going is Ragnarok, is the final chapter where we are describing the end of days with brother against brother and mother against son and sister fighting sister, and the idea that the seas become a dead.
But are we inexorably heading that way?
I don't think there's any inexorably, but I do love the fact that it's there for us as a warning.
And do you find that sort of apocalyptic, apocalypse in the offing, I suppose, do you find that as an author gives you more fuel, it gives you more inspiration?
I certainly found that the events of last year politically have actually energized me in a fictional way. I'm working on a new novel. For the first time in 20 years, I'm going back to my novel Neverwhere. For me, it's taking not only the dispossessed, not only the homeless, not only those who fall through the cracks, but also the refugees, also people who are fleeing war, fleeing intolerable situations, barely getting out with their lives, and then what happens to them. And that, for me, has to go into the fiction.
When the government rode back on its plan to take 3,000 child refugees into the UK under the Dubs scheme, did you feel that the government was reflecting perhaps a more selfish public opinion, or are they leading public opinion?
I just thought it was cowardice. I thought it was moral cowardice in every possible way. We help children. That's what human beings do. And the idea that we would leave 3,000 children in situations where they are at danger, at risk, and more than at risk, where terrible things are happening to them, to me seemed almost inconceivable.
The government said at the time that actually it would be worse for the children if there was still that pull factor.
People don't want to leave home. The stories that I would hear, there's no food because the farmers in the fields were getting shot at and the fields were mined, and now they eat their cats and their dogs with special dispensation from the imam, and they have children, and they go, we will die if we stay here. We may have a chance of life if we get away. These are not people going, I have nothing to do this Thursday, I think I'll go to England, that sounds like the best idea. These are people getting out of intolerable, impossible, nightmarish situations, the like of which we are incredibly lucky not to have to endure.
In the story, The Master Builder, the gods got their wall in the end. Do you think Trump will get his wall?
It remains to be seen whether Trump will actually remain in office at this point and survive long enough to make a giant wall that nobody really wants happen.
So which of your Norse gods is he? If Odin built the wall in your story?
I don't think Trump rates godhood. Trump is right now for me much more like one of these rather sorrowful giants who is rather large and breaks things by sitting down on them.
Neil Gaiman, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Just some breaking news. US media reports say Donald Trump's nominee for Labour Secretary, Andrew Pudzer, is expected to withdraw because he wouldn't get enough support from Republican senators. That's all for now.
We're back at 7 tomorrow night.
Have a very good evening. That is Channel 4 News.
Good evening.